Thank you so much, Randall. That was a wonderful introduction. It reminds me that sometimes in life, inflation is a good thing. You know, a number of people have asked me what I think of Houston, and I grew up in Mumbai, as Randall mentioned, a big, noisy, dirty city that is hot and humid with many occasional thunderbursts and showers. So I feel completely at home. No, I'm actually delighted to be here and have always enjoyed my time in Houston, have good friends here. I thought what I'd do is range a little widely because all of you have the book. So I thought I'm not just going to give you the book. You can go home and read that. What I'll do is talk a little bit about the world, and it'll intersect with the themes of the book. You know, when I started to do this kind of public speaking, I was, in those days, doing the Sunday morning show with George Stephanopoulos. When Stephanopoulos took over from David Brinkley, he asked me to be on his roundtable. And my sparring partner at the time was George Will, the sort of very elegant, erudite, conservative commentator. We became friends, and one day I was telling George that I was going someplace to give a talk, and he said, "So, young man, if you're beginning to go around the country speaking, make sure you have a point." And I said, "Well, George, I have several points." He said, "No, that's too many. People will forget." So I said, "Well, how specific does this point have to be?" He said, "Let me tell you a story. On the old Johnny Carson show," now I have to say at this point, if I've told this story at a college campus, you know, they're hearing like David Brinkley, Johnny Carson. They think I'm talking about the Roman Republic and that I should, you know, take my Metamucil and go to sleep. But I'm guessing that this crowd will know who Johnny Carson was. And he tells a story about how Conrad Hilton was once on the Johnny Carson show. And Conrad Hilton, the founder of Hilton Hotels, is this very elegant man. At the end of that chat, Johnny Carson says, "Mr. Hilton, you've got all of America watching. Is there anything you want to say in conclusion?" And Conrad Hilton thinks for a moment and he says, "Why, yes, Johnny, I do." And he leans into the camera and he says, "My fellow Americans, please remember, the shower curtain goes inside the bathtub." If you owned as many shower curtains as Conrad Hilton did, maybe that would be top on your mind. So I have a confession. I do not have a point of that specific a nature that I'm trying to drive home to you. So I will range a little bit widely, but I thought I'd start with something that I know that is on your minds and has perturbed you a bit because I've talked to some of you in the reception, which is Joe Biden's electoral prospects. Many of you watched my Sunday show and you saw what I said at the start of it. I hope it was clear that this was not advocacy. I was describing an unpleasant reality as I saw it. But the fundamental kind of paradox that we have to look at as a sign of the age we're in is that Joe Biden is presiding over one of the strongest moments in American economic history. The unemployment rate of the United States is currently at close to a 50-year low. It was at an actual 50-year low about 6 months ago. It's edged up very slightly, so it's like at a 46-year low. Inflation is down to, you know, maybe 3%, which in historical terms is very low. If you look at manufacturing employment, it's at it's much higher than at any point in the Trump presidency. If you look at wages, they have been rising, and they've been rising for the bottom 20% faster than the top 20% for the first time in 25 years. If you look at black participation in the labor force, it is now higher than white participation in the labor force, which is the first time in history that has happened. So all of which you just say it's a pretty solid economy, to put it conservatively. Joe Biden has the lowest approval ratings of any president in American history. Something is going on that we don't completely understand. They used to be, in polling, the strongest predictive relationship between two variables was the economy and the president's approval rating. So when you looked at a president, you said, okay, how's the economy doing? What is his approval rating? Those things always moved in tandem. That's why James Carville famously said, when during the Clinton campaign of '92, it's the economy, stupid. And somebody has to sit, James Carville down and say, not anymore. That's the paradox about what's going on right now. And some people say, well, it's inflation. It doesn't work anymore, because for the last 2 years, the public's view of the economy has gone up and up and up, has gotten better and better and better. So for a while, you could have said there was a time lag, or you could have said, no, actually, you don't understand. They view inflation as more important. Whatever the measure, the public now thinks the economy is very good. And they still give no credit to Joe Biden for it. In fact, something even more puzzling has been happening, because this has been going on for a while. It's not just Biden. Biden is now the third president where his approval ratings are detached from the state of the economy. It began with Obama. Obama presided over the strongest recovery of any country from the great financial crisis. To give you a simple statistic, the Eurozone economy and the US economy in 2008, at the time of the global financial crisis, were about the same size. By the end of Obama's term, the US economy was 50% larger than the Eurozone economy. The stock market had tripled in those 8 years, and Barack Obama's approval ratings didn't go up much. It's not even a partisan point. Trump, when he presided over the economy before COVID, it was a very strong economy. A lot of Democrats would say it was basically Obama's economy for that he was riding on, but for whatever reason, it was a very strong economy. Trump has the second lowest approval ratings of any president in American history. So there's something going on where these things are no longer correlating. In fact, you could argue Americans' views of the economy are now shaped by their politics rather than the other way around. In other words, it used to be that your view of the economy shaped your politics. But now it's your view of politics that shapes your view of the economy. Let me give you a simple example. When Donald Trump was elected and inaugurated in January of 2016, 30% of Americans switched their views as to whether the economy was good or bad. All the Democrats who had said this is a great economy suddenly said it's a terrible economy, and Republicans did the opposite. And then they flipped again in 2020. This has again never happened in American history. Your view of reality was not shaped by your politics. So when Truman loses and Eisenhower wins, people's view of the economy didn't change. They may have preferred one or the other, but they saw the same economy. So this is in some ways the kind of the reason I got to thinking about this book. I started thinking about this book about 10 years ago. And what was going through my mind at the time was two things. One, the Obama paradox that I was describing. The economy seemed to be getting better and better, and this guy was getting no credit for it. But the second was, I was noticing something strange happening to the Republican Party. This was the period when the Tea Party begins. And to me, the Tea Party was a very peculiar phenomenon, because the Republican Party is a very hierarchical party. It has always been a very hierarchical party. This is a party that people used to say about presidential nominations, Democrats have to fall in love with their candidate. Think of Kennedy, Obama, Clinton. Republicans fall in line. They elect the next guy on the, John McCain, Bob Dole, the Bushes. This is a party that nominated Richard Nixon 5 times on its presidential nomination, right? So that's the model you had of the Republican Party. But this party was seeing a kind of strange insurgency from within, a bottom-up movement that was kind of taking over the party, the Tea Party. And these people had very unusual concerns. This was not the typical Republican set of issues. There's a very good book by a Yale sociologist, Theda Skocpol, who spent a year basically just talking to these people. And she discovered that while they would initially talk about economics, because they knew as Republicans you were meant to say stuff like, small government and low taxes, 90% of their concerns were cultural issues, were immigration, were multiculturalism, were, when you'd scratch the surface, the fact that there was a black in the White House. It was these visceral, emotive issues that were motivating them. And this insurgency was kind of growing bigger and bigger and becoming a larger and larger part of the party, and nobody knew how to control it. Think of the number of Republican speakers we've had in the last 20 years, right? You've had one Democratic speaker, Nancy Pelosi, and I can't even count the number of Republican speakers we have. In fact, by the end of this evening, we don't even know if Mike Johnson will still be speaker. And that tells you, again, for a party that was hierarchical, based on authority, very, very strange. And it made me think we were witnessing something very unusual happening in politics, which was we were moving away from the kind of core economic issues that had defined the political spectrum in a way in the 20th century to a new set of issues. It used to be very simple to try to figure out where somebody stood on the political landscape. If you wanted to figure out how somebody voted in 1960, you basically asked two questions. Are you in white-collar work or in blue-collar work? And do you make more than the median income, the average American, or less? If you're a white-collar guy making more than the average person, you voted Republican. If you were blue-collar and you made less, you voted Democrat. And that was true across the Western world. It was basically the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. You could map it out. And it was basically an argument over economics, the role of the state in the economy. Republicans wanted a small state, low taxes, and that kind of comes to fruition, or maybe a kind of fullest expression under Reagan. If you think to yourself, this is the most successful Republican president in the last 75 years, and after FDR, he is the counterpart, the Republican version of FDR. And what did he believe in? Ronald Reagan believed in limited government, cut spending, low taxes, strong America, spread democracy abroad, free trade, and had a very sunny, optimistic view of the world. Very, very pro-immigration, for example. Signed the '86 Amnesty Act. I think Donald Trump is against every single thing I just said that Reagan was in favor of, right? I mean, Donald Trump doesn't like immigration, hates free trade, doesn't like the idea of America being, protecting democracy and spreading, its values abroad. Does not particularly care about big government or small government. He's a big spender. I mean, he's spent, between his tax cuts and his COVID spending, about $5 trillion in the 4 years he was in office. It's a very different profile. And if you went, particularly in 2016, to Trump's, his long, crazy public meetings, what you'd notice is through all the rambling and things like, there was a core focus that was very clear. It would take him an hour and a half to say it, but his message was, I've often boiled down to about 4 lines. His basic message in those long public meetings was, the Chinese have taken away your factories, the Mexicans have taken away your jobs, the Muslims are trying to kill you, I'll beat them all up, you'll be great again. That was it. And what that message is basically a message of cultural nationalism, chauvinism, protectionism, right? It's totally different from Reaganism. And its most striking contrast is that Reagan was fundamentally an optimist. And in some ways, to my mind, this is the peculiarity of where America is right now. If you were to say to me, what's the simplest way to predict who's going to win the election in American history, I would say that two things seem to be true. Basically, almost always, the taller candidate wins, and the more optimistic candidate wins. I say almost always because for those of you who really are keeping track, John Kerry was actually a little taller than George W. Bush. But other than that, think about it, right? Like you had Kennedy versus Nixon, right? Obama versus John McCain, Clinton versus George H.W. Bush. And you see what I mean? There's always the guy who's more hopeful, who's more energetic, who's talking about the future in positive tones, who seems to win. Franklin Roosevelt against Herbert Hoover. Except this time, right? The 2016 election, there's no question, the guy who was talking about American carnage won. The guy who was saying America is going down the tubes, is a horrible country, that's the guy who won. So something is happening here. And what I came to realize, and that this is the essence of what I ended up doing with my book, is I realized that we are living through a great cultural backlash. One of the great cultural backlashes in history to 30, 40, 50 years of enormous progress that has taken place. And that we've lived through this kind of almost revolutionary times of progress and openness and advancement, that we don't even realize how big a deal it is until we now see the backlash, until we see how disruptive it is and how unsettling it is. So think about something as simple as the expansion of the global economy. It sounds like a big abstraction, but let me give you a simpler way to think about it. I grew up in India in the 60s and 70s. A country like India was totally disconnected from the free world economy that we think about when we talk about America and Europe. It had high tariff barriers, totally controlled economy, no convertibility of currency. So India was like hermetically sealed off from the economy that the United States was part of. And it wasn't just India. It was China, it was all of Latin America, it was all of Africa. Basically, when you talked about the open world economy, you were talking about the US, Canada, 12 countries in Europe, 3 countries in Asia, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore and Hong Kong as 2 city-states. That's it. And then, it starts opening up. A few countries start, but nothing really changes until you get to the late 80s, early 90s. 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall. This is the date that reshaped the world. And then all of a sudden, everyone is joining in this open world economy. If you think about it, Eastern Europe, communism cracks and crumbles, and all these countries come online. If you look at Latin America, in 1985, every Latin American country was behind those walls. By 1995, they're all part of the open world economy. And most importantly, India and China. I have a simple rule, Zakaria's first law of mathematics. If you take 2.5 billion people and you multiply that number by anything, it becomes a very large number. And that's really what happened when the Indians and the Chinese joined the world economy. All of a sudden you have this incredible, just think about, for example, you wonder why we didn't have inflation for so long? Well, because you had 2.5 billion people willing to make whatever auto part was being made in Michigan for not 10 cents on the dollar, but 3 cents on the dollar, right? And so there was almost like a giant machine of deflation, pumping, keeping prices low. And that was an extraordinary expansion of hope and opportunity for everybody. And it seemed like everyone was, tides were rising. 500 million people are moved out of poverty in the decades after 1989. That's more than in the previous century were moved out of poverty. And it's not just liberalization of markets and of trade. Again, sounds very abstract. Democracy is spreading faster than it's ever spread before. Eastern Europe was all communist. Within 5 years, it was all democratic. Latin America in 1985, every country was ruled by a military junta. By 1995, other than Cuba and Venezuela, all of it had become democratic. Places like Indonesia, the Philippines, started to hold elections, right? Africa had 40 elections in the 1990s. So you have liberalization of trade, democratization of politics, and then, as if this wasn't enough, you have this crazy information revolution, which suddenly connects everybody on the planet in this open, almost democratic technology that means everyone can access everything and everyone in a way that had never happened before. You know, when I was a student, I was on a scholarship in college, and I would call my mom every Saturday. And I remember vividly, I would call her, and at the 3-minute mark, there would be a beep on the phone, because the phone company telling you, you probably want to get off at this point. It's getting very expensive. Now, if you ask yourself, why was the phone company being so nice to its customers? It turns out there was a federal requirement that because otherwise it was seen as price gouging, because the prices would go up so much. Flash forward to a couple of years ago, my daughter, who was then 11 or 12, is chatting with her friend in Singapore, whom she met at some summer camp. And they're talking on FaceTime, each of them on their laptops. And I am getting increasingly upset and nervous and irritated, because I'm like, you've got to get off the phone. And I'm thinking in my head, because this is so expensive. And I have to keep correcting myself to say, it's actually free. And it's a good example of like just how hard it is to change your ways, because I grew up with the idea that communication is siloed and limited and expensive. And she grew up with the knowledge that communication is open and accessible and free. And that is the reality that we've all been living with now, but that is so unusual in the history of the world. I mean, there used to be a huge industry in the United States called arbitrage, right? You bought in Chicago and sold in New York because there was a huge price differential between the two. Well, that doesn't exist anymore because it's all on Google, and nobody can have very large variations in prices anymore. So, and those are just like some of the small ways in which this huge technology revolution has transformed us. It created essentially a new economy, a digital economy of bits and bytes that sits on top of the old economy of atoms. And essentially the old economy of atoms has become a commodity. I mean, think about what a Tesla is now. It's software on wheels, right? That's why, it's an amazing thing. I have a Tesla, and the other day I saw somebody did a comparison where they took a $2 million Bugatti and they raced it against my Tesla, 0 to 60, and my Tesla won. And the reason is, the car is just software and wheels. There's no friction. There's no parts. There's nothing that has to move. There's nothing that needs oil. That's the new economy. It's everything is controlled by these information flows, these electrons moving around. And it's all on a huge open platform that everyone can access and everyone can connect to. And these trends that I'm describing, liberalization of markets and trade, democratization of politics, the openness of the economy, are all happening at the same time, and each reinforcing the other. So it sort of made people feel like this, I should correct myself, it made Americans feel like this is all the natural working out of how human beings want to live. This human beings want to be free, they want to live in an open, connected world. They want to be governed democratically. And who knows, maybe that is what people inside want. But there was something else going on. These were the ideologies of the most powerful country in the history of the world, that during those decades, the decades after the fall of the Berlin Wall, had no competition, right? We don't think about it again because we grew up, we were living through it, but the United States in 1995 is like the Roman Empire at its peak. Think about it. When in previous history have you had a single power that really faced no competitor, no competition? I mean, who was going to be the competition? In 1995, China was 2% of global GDP. The United States was 26% of global GDP. In 1995, the Russian economy had shrunk by 50% in the last 5 years. That's more than it shrunk during World War II. So Russia is on its knees. China is an infant. Who else is there? Who are the other rich countries in the world? Well, there's Japan and Germany, two countries that owe their security to the United States, live under the American nuclear umbrella for their security, and by the way, have slightly complicated histories in terms of wanting to assert themselves geopolitically, let's say, right? That's it, right? India is less than 0.5% of global GDP at this point. So the United States is striding the world like a colossus. And so, of course, the things the United States want to do is what everybody is copying. And everybody, so, we always think that everybody follows us because we have the best ideas. A lot of people follow us because we're very rich and powerful. And we sometimes forget that, that's what's going on. And you begin to see this reality when things begin to change. First big thing is the Iraq War. The massive aura of American military legitimacy and power cracks, right? This is the most powerful country in the history of the world. You've probably heard many times in those days, we spend more on defense than the next 20 countries put together. Well, somehow we were not able to prevail in a small country 6,000 miles away against a bunch of people who were not particularly well trained. I remember when somebody was once trying to explain to me, this was a Pentagon official, why the Afghan war was going so well, because we were training the new Afghan army. And he said, but you have to understand, it takes time because we've got to first teach these people to read, then we have to teach them to follow in orders, and then read the army manuals, read our tactics. And I'm looking at him and I said, but General, the Taliban don't know how to read, and they seem to be beating us. Why are you assuming that we need to train them to be like a Western army? And there was some mismatch there where we didn't understand. We had all this power on one dimension, but they had power at a different dimension, which is they were willing to fight and die, right? And that's a very powerful, when a bunch of soldiers is willing to die, and they're willing to die for a cause they believe is deep and true for them, you can have all the education and all the military firepower in the world. It's not enough. So that begins to erode the aura of American power. The global financial crisis is the other great moment where this shifts. There's a moment in Hank Paulson's memoirs. You remember Hank Paulson was the CEO of Goldman Sachs who becomes the Treasury Secretary. And during the financial crisis, he goes to China to see his counterpart in China, a man named Wang Qishang. And he walks in and Wang Qishang says to him, my friend, come on in. I always thought you were my teacher. You were my mentor. Every time we tried to figure out what to do, open a new regulatory agency, we would ask ourselves, what do the Americans do? And he said, I look at what's going on in the world with this global financial crisis, and I realize you have nothing to teach us. We have nothing to learn from you. And that feeling, that break in the aura of American economic power, the idea that the American model was the most sophisticated, that I think was a big, big deal, particularly to countries like China, which at that point began to think to themselves, we need to chart our own course. And it was shortly after that Xi Jinping started to say, the East is rising and the West is declining. And then we had the chaos of the Tea Party and the debt ceiling, and then Trump and Brexit, right? And Western politics, in particular American politics, seems totally dysfunctional. So our political power, in a sense, eroded, right? So you go from military power, economic power, political power, all eroded, all degraded. All of a sudden, the city is not shining so brightly anymore. And all of that wouldn't be enough, but then you were also getting another thing happening, which was competition, competitors. China was rising. That country that had been 2% of global GDP is now 18% of global GDP. Russia, that was down on its knees in 1995, Well, the Russian economy in doing that well, but Russia had risen again because ultimately it's an oil and gas superpower, and oil prices had gone up, and the Russian state was able to reconstitute itself. Putin was able to reestablish control of that country, and was able to extract enough resources that Russia was able to be a great power again. And then you were seeing the rise of other powers like Iran in the region. And you put all that together and you suddenly see we're in a new world now. We are, for the first time, in a world of great power competition. We haven't had that since the Cold War. And along with that has come a great deal of pushback on the American model, if you will, right? All of a sudden you have people like Putin saying, we don't want Westernization. We don't want Americanization. And it's not just Putin. Xi Jinping says this as strongly, as loudly. We don't want all this individualism and liberalism and liberty. Viktor Orban in Hungary says the same thing. And that's, to my mind, the most unsettling part about this. It's not just a geopolitical phenomenon out there in, bad old Russia and China and Iran. It's happening right here, right? There are people in the West saying, we don't like the way the world has been going for the last several decades. We don't like all this individual rights. Donald Trump is not a particularly articulate spokesman for all this, but he has tapped into something. Viktor Orban, actually, in Hungary, puts it very well because he understands what he's talking about. He says, liberalism has been based on the idea of the individual rights, individual freedom, individual liberty. I am against that. I believe there are things that are more important than the individual. Family, God, country, tradition, religion, and that's what he's basing his appeal on. And that appeal is strong. Don't forget, don't misunderstand. And that is what a lot of this movement is. It is a cultural backlash to all these years of advances. And it's a cultural backlash because when you expand and when you open up the economy and when you open up society in the way that I was describing, people also have kind of identity revolutions. Think about the role of women over the last 30 or 40 years, and think about how seismic that change is. Because all of human society, we've had one group on top and one group at the bottom, and the guys on top have oppressed the guys at the bottom. And unfortunately, that's been true no matter where you look. It varies who's on top and who's at the bottom, except in one thing. In all of those societies, women were always second-class citizens. Every one of those societies that we know of in recorded history. And what has happened over the last 40 years is a transformation of that reality. We have finally, thank God, gotten to a point where, 200 years ago, women were the property of men in many countries. And in the last 40 years, you have really, we're not there yet, but there's an enormous progress that has been made in terms of women's equality and women's dignity and women's rights. But think about how disruptive that is, right? You've taken something that has been one way for all of human history, and it was a core bedrock of the family, the basic unit of society. And you're saying, we're going to change the power dynamic, the fundamental power dynamic here. Think about how much that disrupts things, how much it unsettles people, how much it makes them uneasy. And you have a sense of the reaction. And let me give you a piece of evidence for that. If you look at every one of the modern reactionary religious fundamentalist movements around the world, and I call them modern because they are actually modern. They all think they're going back in time, but they were all very recent. Islamic fundamentalism, the ultra-Orthodox movement in Israel, Christian nationalism. What you notice is they all have one common concern. They want women back in the kitchen, right? The first thing the Taliban does when it comes into Afghanistan is, let's get the girls out of school and let's get them out of universities. What is the ultra-Orthodox great concern? We don't want our women to have to work. We don't want our women to have to serve in the military. We don't want our women to have to go to secular schools and learn science and things like that where they could actually get jobs, because that'll take them out of the house. Even people like Putin and Xi Jinping have the same cultural reaction. Xi Jinping gave a speech one day, about 6 months ago, where he said, we need the women to have a new conception of femininity and womanhood, which is go back into the kitchen, stop working so much, and have more kids. It's all part of this idea that, the world has moved too far too fast. Stop the train, I want to get off. And that reality is the one we're living with. And when you are living through that kind of a period, people don't care as much about the economy. They pretend they care about the economy, but Tony Blair once said this to me, which I thought was a very profound insight. He said, one thing I've learned about in these years in politics is when people get very anxious, and they get very anxious and insecure and uncertain about the future, about their situation, they don't move left economically, they move right culturally. In other words, they don't sit there thinking, oh God, things are looking crazy, I need a government program. No, they think to themselves, my world is disappearing, why is it disappearing, who is doing this? And then you find the demagogue who says, those are the people who are doing it. And they look different, and they sound different, and they worship different gods. And that's who the problem is. And if we get rid of them, we'll take you back to when the world didn't have all these, when you didn't have all these strange colored looking people and uppity women. And, there's a very important word in Donald Trump's MAGA hat. Again. Make America great again. Because you're going back to that Garden of Eden. Now, you might ask yourself, those of you who have good enough memories, because my theory about nostalgia as a form of politics is it rests on one very important thing, which is a bad memory. Nikki Haley tweeted during the campaign, wouldn't it be nice to, I think the tweet was exactly, wasn't life simple when we were growing up? Wasn't life so simple and uncomplicated? Why can't we go back to those days? Now, I did the math. So Nikki Haley grows up basically in the early 1970s. And I'm thinking to myself, yes, if only we could go back to those halcyon days when the United States was fighting a brutal war in Vietnam with 500,000 troops, 8,500 miles away from home, losing the war badly, when the economy was going through what no economist could even understand, which was called stagflation, the combination of stagnant growth and high inflation caused by the quadrupling of oil prices, when domestically we were facing the first president in history who was about to be impeached for engaging in criminal conduct while in office. Yes, if only we could go back to those wonderful days. It's sort of, you do say to yourself, what are you thinking about? But it is that idea that we are dealing with. And that is so at heart, it is the politics of nostalgia. It is the politics about some forgotten Garden of Eden that we can go back to. And everybody believes, we all do, right, that things were easier back when. First of all, we forget, we were kids back then. We didn't have to pay rent, we didn't have to pay mortgages, we didn't have to... But part of it is also, it's a human survival mechanism. We remember the good stuff. We don't remember the bad stuff. We push it away. Right? That's how we get through life. And I think until we can get out of that politics of nostalgia, until we can move forward, we're going to find ourselves stuck in the politics of a cultural backlash in which it's always easier to make the case that things are terrible, that life is awful, that we've strayed from our ideals. And it's very hard to make the case for the slow, important work of progress, the messy reality of daily life, of politics as an instrument of improving people's lives, of bettering their situation. We'll do it. And you'll see in the book at the end, I'm hopeful, because there's only one answer here, and it's to move forward, because you can't actually move back. But it's going to be a long, hard road. Thank you all very much.